June 17, 1943, Radom Ghetto, occupied Poland. No one screamed when the cage slammed shut. There were no speeches, no trials, only the harsh snap of metal locking into place in the security yard of the compound. A dry, final sound, a wordless warning to every other woman watching. This is how it ends when you choose to defy the system. Inside the punishment cage, Rivka Adler did not cry. She was 24 years old and weighed barely over 90 pounds. She wore the same gray dress she had been wearing for 3 months now, soaked through with sweat, dirt, and other people's tears. Her hands shook in the cold of early morning, but her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, beyond the ghetto's barbed wire, beyond the guard posts where German soldiers smoked cigarettes and watched the sunrise with open boredom. And yet, reduced to that fragile silhouette behind rusted bars, Rivka Adler had already saved more lives than entire armies ever would. Women who would never know her name. Women whose faces Rivka replayed every night before sleep, whispering their names as if they were a silent prayer. Girls like Noah Klein, just 17, who had arrived days earlier on a transport from Warsaw, empty-eyed, skin so pale it looked like glass, already marked for disappearance on the next train heading east. Mothers like Miriam Rosen, 32, labeled unproductive in German records, disposable for having one mouth too many to feed and a body that no longer produced enough to justify its existence. Nurses like Hanna Feldman, 41, who learned how to hide fevers, infections, and wounds to buy time. Sometimes a day, sometimes a week, sometimes a month. Just enough to keep breathing. Just enough to see one more sunrise. The Nazis didn't cage her out of blind cruelty. They did it because they noticed a pattern. Lists altered overnight. Inspections that failed without explanation. Transports leaving with fewer women than planned. Empty spaces left in rail cars meant to be packed. Always women. Always Jewish. Always slipping through cracks that should not have existed in a system engineered for perfect efficiency. And at the center of those failures, almost invisible in the shadows of Workshop Building Number 7, was Rivka. Oberfuhrer Otto Weiss called it organized indiscipline. Greta Hoffmann, the guard with platinum blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, eyes frozen in a stare that never blinked, used another phrase, moral contamination. To them, Rivka was not just another prisoner waiting her turn to die. She was a quiet threat, a virus spreading without sound, infecting the machinery of the Reich with something as dangerous as hope. As the June cold crept between the bars and hunger made her body vibrate down to the bone, Rivka understood something few people grasped in a place where death had become routine. Survival was not enough. Living was not enough. Saving others was an act of resistance. She would leave that cage. Not that day. Not without pain. But she would leave it. And when the war ended, because all wars end, even the ones that feel eternal, Rivka Adler would carry with her the names, the faces, and the weight of more than 100 Jewish women she had saved. She would live to 81, knowing that every extra year, every birthday, every spring was time stolen back from death. Because in the darkest corner of the 20th century, where humanity was ground down by the Nazi machine with industrial precision, a Jewish woman from Radom proved that even in the heart of hell, there were still cracks where life could slip through. To understand who Rivka Adler was, you first have to look closely at the place where everything happened. The Radom ghetto was the second largest in the Third Reich, and by mid-1943 more than 160,000 Polish Jews had already passed through its overcrowded buildings and factories, structures built for a single purpose: to extract human labor until nothing was left. It was not an extermination camp like Auschwitz. It functioned as a waiting room for death, a place where Jews were allowed to exist only as long as their bodies could endure. Once they fell ill or grew weak, they stopped being useful, and what stopped being useful simply vanished. Every week, German authorities compiled deportation lists with obsessive precision. Names pulled from registries, filed in folders, written onto forms, childless women, sick men, children under 10, the elderly, everything categorized and assigned to transports heading east. Chełmno, Auschwitz, Treblinka. The ghetto's prisoners were not naive. They knew the trains never came back. They knew the promised letters never arrived. They knew erased families were not being resettled on German farms. They knew. But knowing and being able to act were separated by an abyss of constant fear and total surveillance. The Nazi machine had made resistance nearly impossible. Jewish councils were forced to cooperate under threat of mass punishment. Prisoners were required to meet quotas or face collective reprisals. The system didn't just eliminate bodies, it destroyed the very possibility of disobedience. And yet, within that mechanism designed to grind lives into dust, there were cracks. Small, almost invisible, but real. Rivka Adler noticed them before most. Before the war, she had been an ordinary young woman, the daughter of a tailor and a schoolteacher, raised in Radom among bolts of fabric, books, and the steady hum of her father's sewing machine. She had an older brother, Jacob, who dreamed of studying medicine. She had friends, modest plans, the idea of working in a library, getting married, building a family. She had a life, until September 1939, when everything collapsed. The German invasion was swift. Within 6 months, Radom's Jews were confined to barely 4 square kilometers. Her father died of typhus in 1940. Her mother was deported in 1941. Jacob disappeared while trying to cross into Soviet territory. At 22, Rivka was completely alone, but not broken. In 1942, she was assigned to a textile factory inside the ghetto, sewing buttons onto German uniforms 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Women who failed to meet quotas were replaced immediately, and being replaced meant landing on a deportation list. Rivka always met her quota, and at the same time, she watched. She studied how records were handled, how lists were corrected, how guards checked tattooed numbers, how officers consulted files, and more than anything, she paid attention to the failures, to oversights, misspelled names, duplicates. The Nazi system was efficient, yes, but it was run by people, and people made mistakes. Rivka learned how to use them. At first, the acts were almost nothing. A 19-year-old seamstress named Rivka Halpern appeared on a transport list scheduled for March 12, 1943. Rivka saw the name and memorized it. The next day, when a guard left the list on a table to step outside for a cigarette, Rivka approached and erased a single letter in the surname with a pencil. Halpern became Halpern, an invisible change, barely there, but enough. During verification, the name no longer matched the records. Rivka was sent back to the housing block. The guard assumed it was a clerical error. Rivka Halpern survived a transport that ended the lives of 847 people. That was how it began. And Rivka understood something essential. There was no need to destroy the system, only to deceive it. The weeks that followed became a brutal lesson in patience and almost surgical precision. Rivka never acted on impulse. She never gambled everything on a desperate, heroic gesture. Her resistance was cold, methodical, nearly scientific, silent and invisible, like the explanations about the human body her brother Jacob had once given her. Before manipulating the system, she had to understand it completely. For weeks, she studied the guards' habits. She memorized who smoked and at what hour, who was easily distracted, who was obsessive, who was careless. She learned the morning inspection schedule by heart, always 6:15 a.m., except on Wednesdays, when rain sometimes delayed it until 6:30. She also memorized the names of women marked for deportation, repeating them silently again and again so they wouldn't disappear from her mind. And when an opening appeared, a lapse, a misfiled record, an officer muttering to himself, she acted with movements so smooth and natural, they seemed accidental. Sometimes she erased names from lists when no one was watching. Other times she altered dates, pushing transports from March into April. Occasionally she hid sick women in sections of the building the guards avoided because they smelled bad or were too dark. Every action was a calculated risk. Every success, a small miracle. Possible only because Rivka had memorized every detail, anticipated every variable, prepared for every contingency. And those tiny miracles accumulated like drops of water that, over time, fill a glass. In April 1943, Rivka met Hannah Feldman, a 41-year-old Jewish nurse who had lost her husband and 2 children in earlier deportations. She had nothing left to lose, which made her dangerous, but also invaluable. One day, Hannah sat beside Rivka in the infirmary and spoke in a low voice. She said she knew what Rivka was doing. Rivka felt her heart stop. Hannah went on. She had seen how Rivka saved Noah and Sarah. She said Rivka was careful, but not invisible. She promised she would say nothing. She said she wanted to help. When Rivka asked why, Hannah answered without emotion. She said she had already killed her own children. When the Germans came for them, Hannah had given them sleeping pills, thinking it would be gentler. But the pills hadn't worked fast enough. The Germans took them anyway. They woke up alone, terrified, on the train. Without their mother, Rivka proposed something simple. If a woman was too sick to pass inspection, Hannah would declare her temporarily quarantined and keep her hidden until the lists changed. It was extraordinarily risky. If the Germans discovered hidden women, both of them would be executed immediately. Hannah accepted without hesitation. Together they saved 7 women in May, 10 in June, 14 in July. The system kept running. The transports left every week, on schedule. But some of the cracks had already become narrow, dark tunnels, and through them, life seeped out drop by drop. The Nazis, however, were not blind. By late July 1943, Oberfuhrer Otto Weiss began to notice inconsistencies. Transports were leaving with fewer women than expected. Lists didn't match. And they all pointed to the same building, the one where Rivka Adler worked. Weiss, methodical and a veteran of the First World War, saw Jews as a logistical problem. And logistical problems, he believed, were solved with efficiency. So he ordered an investigation. He assigned it to Greta Hoffman, the guard responsible for the building, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, with a stare that never blinked. Greta knew how to detect weakness, and she understood that the greatest weakness of any prisoner was hope. For 3 weeks, she watched in silence. She saw Rivka approach the record tables, whisper with Hannah, memorize names. She couldn't prove anything, but Rivka was too careful. Greta was certain. On August 15, 1943, she submitted her report. Rivka Adler was organizing acts of silent sabotage. She has no weapons, but she is altering the system from the inside. She is a threat that must be neutralized immediately. Otto Weiss read the report twice and gave the order to build the cages. They were not ordinary cells. They were iron structures designed with a single purpose: to break the human will. 1.5 meters tall, 1 meter wide, 1 meter deep, too low to stand upright without pain, too narrow to lie down with the body fully extended. They were placed at the exact center of the industrial complex's security yard, where every working woman passed, where everyone would see the prisoner exposed to the merciless Polish summer sun and to the sharp autumn cold that was already beginning to announce itself. They had no roof, no protection from rain or wind, not even privacy for the most basic human needs. The goal was not only to punish the body, it was to fracture the mind, to erase will, to turn the prisoner into a living warning of the cost of resistance. On August 17, 1943, at exactly 5 in the morning, while darkness still covered the ghetto, 3 German guards entered the housing building where Rivka slept. The women lay crammed into 3-tier wooden bunks, 4 bodies where 2 were meant to fit. There were no shouts, no commands. They grabbed Rivka by the arms and dragged her outside while the others watched in absolute silence, frozen. No one dared to scream. No one dared to move. Fear was so thick it felt physical. Rivka was shoved into the cage like an animal. The iron door slammed shut, and the heavy lock fell into place with a sound that landed like a sentence. She remained there for 3 full days. No food, not a drop of water. No idea how long it would last, or what they expected from her. Guards passed the cage every 2 hours during their rounds. Sometimes they stopped for a moment to look at her, then moved on. The women crossing the yard on their way to the factories avoided looking directly at her. Not out of indifference, but fear. Fear of being next. Fear that a glance of compassion might be read as complicity. On the second night, a summer storm broke without warning. Rain poured down on Rivka mercilessly, soaking her to the bone. Her body shook with uncontrollable cold. Her lips cracked from a desperate, absurd thirst, while water streamed down her face. Her hands clung to the bars until her knuckles turned white. But she did not cry. She did not beg. She did not ask for mercy from the guards who passed by smoking under black umbrellas. She knew any sign of weakness would be used as propaganda. They wanted the other women to see her broken, destroyed, reduced to a shadow. They wanted fear to spread through the ghetto like a virus, and Rivka's silent resistance to die publicly, along with her dignity. She did not give them that pleasure. Not that day. Not ever. At dawn on the 3rd day, when the sun barely surfaced on the gray horizon, the cage was opened. Rivka stepped out with extreme difficulty. Her legs barely responded after 3 days curled in a fetal position. Her vision blurred from dehydration. Still, she walked back to the housing building on her own, step by step, dragging her feet, refusing to fall. No help. No tears. No surrender. Greta Hoffman watched from a distance, arms crossed, and frowned. She had expected to see a woman completely destroyed, a prisoner shattered, ready to confess everything. Instead, she saw something she did not understand. The cage had not stopped Rivka. It had only forced her to become more careful, more patient, more intelligent. In September 1943, a 17-year-old girl named Noah Klein arrived at the ghetto on one of the last massive transports from Warsaw. She had traveled for 3 days in a cattle car without water, pressed against 80 other people in a space meant for 40. She was thin as a bird, pale as a ghost, with large hazel eyes that seemed to absorb all the horror of the world without quite understanding it. She had lost her entire family during the journey. Her father died of a heart attack inside the railcar. Her mother was separated at the station, and her two younger brothers were sent directly to another train. She was completely alone, exposed, unprotected, and by Nazi standards, standards that reduced people to livestock, entirely expendable. Noah Klein was assigned to building number 7, the same place where Rivka worked. That first night, she never lay down. She sat on her splintered wooden bunk, staring at the shadows cast by the exterior lamps onto the cracked walls. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't touch the ration of black bread or the watery soup she'd been given. She just watched the emptiness with an absent expression. Rivka observed her for hours from the upper bunk and recognized something disturbingly familiar in that look. Total resignation. The preemptive acceptance of death. Noah had stopped fighting on the inside. She had no hope, no reason to keep living. She only wanted the end to come quickly, and if possible, without pain. Near midnight, when most of the women were asleep or pretending to be, Rivka quietly climbed down from her bunk and sat beside Noah on the edge of the bed. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice so low it was barely a whisper. Noah took nearly a full minute to answer. When she did, her voice sounded hollow, automatic, as if the words meant nothing. "Noah. Where are you from?" "Warsaw." Rivka nodded and said nothing more for a long while. She simply stayed there, sitting beside her, sharing a silence heavy with something like solidarity. When Noah began to blink slowly, overcome by exhaustion, Rivka spoke again. There would be an inspection the next day. The Germans would select women for the next transport. Noah was new. She was weak. She looked sick. She would likely be chosen among the first. Noah didn't react, as if she already knew, as if she had already accepted it. Rivka continued, her voice steady. If Noah did exactly what she said, without deviating even a millimeter, she would survive, for now. Maybe until the next day. Maybe a week. Rivka couldn't promise anything more. Noah slowly turned her head, as though the movement required immense effort. For the first time since her arrival, something flickered faintly in her eyes. It wasn't hope. It was curiosity, an unspoken question. "Why help me?" it seemed to ask. "You don't know me? I'm nobody." Rivka offered the smallest of smiles, sad, restrained, never reaching her tired eyes. "Because I can," she said, "and because someone has to." The inspection took place the following morning, exactly at 6, as it did every Tuesday and Friday. The women were lined up in the yard under the gray light of dawn, 5 rows of 20 each. Greta Hoffman moved slowly among them, a clipboard pressed to her chest, marking names with a fountain pen. Behind her, 2 SS officers watched with professional boredom, smoking cigarettes and commenting on the weather. It was a weekly routine, another administrative procedure, like counting inventory in a warehouse. Noah stood in the central row, exactly where Rivka had told her to stand. Rivka had spent the entire previous night teaching her 3 simple, vital rules. Stand completely straight, no matter the pain. Look forward without blinking when Greta passes. Answer only yes, ma'am, or no, ma'am. Not one word more, not one word less. No explanations, no pleading. When Greta stopped in front of Noah, her blue eyes scanned her from head to toe with mechanical efficiency. "Name." "Noah Klein." Her voice trembled slightly, but it was clear. "How long have you been here?" 2 days, ma'am." Greta consulted the list carefully. Noah's name was marked with a bright red cross. That meant immediate transport. High priority. Too weak to be useful. But before Greta could order Noah pulled from the line, something broke the routine. A woman at the far end of the most distant row collapsed without warning. She hit the ground with a dull thud that echoed through the silence. Instinctively, the others stepped back. The German officers frowned, irritated by the interruption, and Greta walked toward the fallen woman with visible annoyance. She was older, perhaps around 50, with completely white hair. Her breathing was labored, unmistakably so. She was clearly suffering from something serious and, in the eyes of the system, useless for any productive purpose. While Greta was distracted examining her, Rivka moved. She didn't run. She didn't do anything dramatic. She took just 2 measured steps to the left, just enough to place herself in front of the wooden table where Greta had left the clipboard when responding to the emergency. With a quick motion, so smooth it looked natural, Rivka picked up the pencil and crossed out the red mark beside Noah's name with a single horizontal line. She placed the pencil back exactly where it had been and returned to her position in the line. The entire act lasted less than 10 seconds, maybe 8. No one noticed, except for 2 nearby women who immediately looked away. When Greta returned after ordering the fallen woman taken to the infirmary, or perhaps directly to the deportation truck, she reviewed the list with a frown. She looked at Noah, looked at the clipboard, looked at Noah again. The name was spelled correctly, but the red cross was gone. Probably a last-minute error, she thought. Someone in the administrative office must have corrected the list without notifying her. Greta exhaled in irritation and moved on to the next woman. Noah Klein was not selected that day. Half an hour later, when the line dissolved and the women returned to their buildings before heading to the factories, Noah searched for Rivka with her eyes. Their gazes met for barely a second. They said nothing. They didn't need to. In that moment, something essential changed inside Noah. She was no longer resigned. She was no longer waiting quietly for death. She had understood that even there, even now, it was possible to fight. As the months passed and autumn gave way to winter, Rivka's system grew increasingly complex and refined. Hanna Feldman continued hiding sick women in the infirmary, inventing quarantine diagnoses the Germans preferred not to verify for fear of contagion. Rivka Halpern, the 19-year-old seamstress saved months earlier, began helping by forging temporary work permits, copying the German supervisor's signature with unsettling precision. Miriam Rosen, the 32-year-old mother who had kept her 3-year-old daughter hidden for weeks beneath floorboards, began organizing discreet watch rotations to warn others when guards approached without notice. It wasn't a formal movement. There were no ranks, no defined structure, no name, no secret meetings, no political manifestos, no declared leader. But it had Rivka, and Rivka had created something more powerful than an organization. She had designed a method, a system within the system, a crack that kept widening. She also possessed something the Nazis never expected to find in a starving prisoner: an extraordinary memory. While many tried to forget in order to survive, Rivka remembered everything: full names and identification numbers, exact dates of past transports, selection patterns, inspection schedules that shifted with the day and the weather, the habits of every guard. Who was strict? Who was careless? Who feared typhus? Who smoked in secret? Every detail was stored in her mind like a tool for the future. In October 1943, Rivka managed to save 11 women in a single transport. In November, it was 16. In December, 22. By the time August 1944 arrived, Rivka Adler had saved more than 100 Jewish women from the Radom ghetto. She didn't rescue them with weapons or explosives. She didn't rely on outside contacts. She did it with a pencil, with memory and administrative errors, with patience, silence, and the unshakable conviction that even the most perfect system always has cracks. The numbers kept growing not because Rivka became more reckless, but because she became exponentially more efficient. She learned from every success which tactics worked best. She adjusted her methods carefully after every near miss, every dangerous moment. And above all, she had understood something that even some armed resistance groups never fully grasped. The most effective weapon against a totalitarian system was not brute force or spectacular sabotage. It was systematic invisibility, silent deception, a form of resistance the system doesn't detect until it's already too late. But even the most careful invisibility has its limits. And in January 1944, when the Polish winter covered the ghetto in heavy, filthy snow, that limit was reached. The second cage was different. This time it wasn't a punishment meant to break her will. It was a public interrogation, a political statement. On January 8, 1944, at 3 in the afternoon, as the sun began to sink, Rivka was taken from the textile factory and brought directly before Otto Weiss. Not to a closed office, not to a private room hidden from view, but to the exact center of the main courtyard, so that everyone would witness what was about to happen. The women were forced to form a circle around them, an amphitheater of unwilling witnesses. Weiss was tall and thin, around 50 years old, with visible scars on his face that spoke of earlier wars and battles survived. He didn't shout like other, more sadistic officers. He didn't beat her or threaten immediate violence. He didn't need to. His mere presence, the way he stood perfectly still, the unblinking stare, was enough to inspire terror. He stopped in front of Rivka and spoke in a calm, almost conversational voice, which made it far more unsettling than shouting ever could. Rivka Adler, 24 years old, seamstress, identification number 50847, no living family, no children, no obvious reason to continue occupying space and consuming resources. He paused deliberately, letting each word land with weight. And yet, he continued, here you are, still alive, still working, still useful, apparently. Rivka didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on a point just over Weiss's shoulder. He went on in the same measured tone. In the last 6 months, we have detected statistical discrepancies in 47 transport lists. Not many, 3 or 4 names per list, but enough that the totals don't align at the end of each month. They are always linked to your sector, and always to specific women. The guard Greta Hoffman is convinced you are directly responsible. Another pause. He lit a cigarette slowly. But I have no direct proof. I haven't seen you touch a list. I have no reliable witnesses, only numbers that don't add up, and a reasonable suspicion. He stepped closer, close enough for Rivka to smell tobacco on his breath. So, I'm going to offer you something I almost never offer, an opportunity. If you tell me exactly how you've done it, who helps you, how you access the records, what methods you use, I will let you live. I'll assign you a position in the administrative office, better food, personal protection, a private room. You could even save more women, he added, if you cooperate with me and work within the official system. It was an obvious trap, and Rivka understood it instantly. Weiss didn't want to save anyone. He wanted names, methods, proof. He wanted to identify every accomplice and crush any trace of resistance at the root. Rivka looked him in the eyes for the first time and answered with a single word. Clear, steady. No. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop. Otto Weiss nodded slowly. There was no surprise in his expression, almost a quiet satisfaction, as if this were exactly the answer he had expected. "Then you will return to the cage," he said. "This time with no time limit. You will come out only when you decide to speak, or when your body finally gives up." Rivka was locked inside the iron structure again. But this time, something was profoundly different. She was no longer truly alone. For the next 4 weeks, 26 full days, while she remained trapped beneath the pale, merciless January sky, something extraordinary and unexpected unfolded. The women of Building Number 7 kept working. Hanna Feldman continued hiding the sick, inventing diagnoses, and taking greater risks with every passing day. Rivka Halpern forged documents more boldly, refining the German supervisor's signature until it became indistinguishable from the original. Noah Klein, the 17-year-old who months earlier had been resigned to die, began memorizing lists just as Rivka had, whispering names into the darkness. Miriam Rosen organized increasingly effective lookout rotations, using subtle visual signals the guards never noticed. The system Rivka had created no longer depended on her alone. It wasn't a personality cult. It wasn't a hierarchy doomed to collapse without its center. It was something more organic, more resilient. She had planted a method, a possibility, a practical way to resist, and those seeds were growing. Inside the cage, Rivka passed her days in near total silence. The January cold was brutal, bone-deep, stabbing. Her body shook with uncontrollable spasms. Her lips bled from deep cracks. The tips of her fingers turned bluish. But she did not speak. She did not yield. She did not beg. Every night, from the windows of the building, the women watched her in silence. They couldn't free her directly. They had no tools to break the lock, no weapons to confront the guards. But they could keep working. They could keep the cracks in the system open. And for now, that was enough. On February 3, 1944, after 26 full days in the cage, Rivka was released abruptly. Not because she spoke, not because she surrendered, not because Weiss obtained what he wanted, but because he realized something that unsettled him deeply. Keeping her locked up was turning her into a living symbol, a breathing martyr. And martyrs, even living ones, are infinitely more dangerous than ordinary saboteurs because they inspire others. When Rivka emerged from the cage that morning, she could barely walk. 2 women held her by the arms and carried her back to the housing building. Hanna examined her immediately, hands trembling. Severe hypothermia, extreme malnutrition with possible permanent damage, dangerous dehydration, multiple infected wounds. "You should be dead," Hanna whispered, as she covered her with every blanket she could find. "Medically speaking, you shouldn't still be alive. I don't understand how you're still here." Rivka managed a faint smile. Her cracked lips bled as they moved. "Not yet," she murmured. "It's not my time yet." In March 1944, the Nazis officially began the liquidation of the Rodham Ghetto. The decision had been made in Berlin months earlier. The ghetto was no longer needed. Textile production could be relocated. The Jews still living there were considered residual material, to be processed quickly. Transports to Auschwitz and Chełmno intensified dramatically. No longer were 3 or 4 trains leaving each week. Now there were 2 transports a day. Thousands of Jews were being sent away every week. The factories shut down one by one, and with them disappeared the fragile protection that work had offered to those still deemed useful. Buildings were emptied methodically. starting with those farthest from the center. The ghetto, once home to more than 160,000 people, was rapidly turning into a ghost town of deserted streets and shattered windows. Rivka knew time was running out for good. But she didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She didn't give in. In April, she saved 18 more women. In May, 14. In June, 9. Each time it became harder. The guards were on alert after the cage episode. Lists were reviewed more often by multiple officers. Inspections grew deeper, more erratic. And still, Rivka kept finding cracks. Smaller now, narrower, but just wide enough for a few lives to slip through. On August 7, 1944, the last mass transport left the Radom ghetto. Rivka Adler was on it. She wasn't alone. With her were Hannah, Rivka, Noah, and Miriam, women who had become more than allies. They had made it that far because of the system Rivka had built, step by step. Now together, they would face whatever came next. The train moved east for 3 days in sealed cattle cars. No water, no food, no light. When the doors finally opened, they were in Auschwitz-Birkenau. On the ramp, the women were immediately divided into 2 lines, one to the right, one to the left. Veteran prisoners whispered as they passed, "Right is life, left is death, right is work, left is gas." Rivka was sent to the right and survived the selection. Hannah was sent to the right. Noah, too. Rivka, Miriam, and 5 other women from their group were sent to the left, toward the gas chambers disguised as showers. Rivka tried to move, tried to cross the line, tried to reach Rivka. An SS guard slammed her back with the butt of his rifle, crushing her ribs hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. It was the first and only time Rivka screamed during the entire war, a scream of helpless fury swallowed by hundreds of others. The final 9 months of the conflict dissolved into a fog of horror no account can fully contain. Auschwitz until January 1945. Then, as the Red Army approached, the Nazis evacuated the camp and forced thousands of prisoners onto death marches westward. Rivka was transferred to Bergen-Belsen amid chaos, endless marches where more people died than inside the camps themselves. Hunger that drove people to eat grass, disease spreading unchecked, cold that froze bodies into grotesque shapes. Rivka survived day by day, hour by hour. Hannah died of typhus in December 1944, delirious, whispering the names of her children. Noah was executed during a forced evacuation in January 1945 for failing to walk fast enough. Rivka disappeared during one of the death marches and was never found, not even her remains. Of the more than 100 women Rivka had saved with precision in the Radom ghetto, only 12 were alive at the end of the war in May 1945. 12 out of more than 100. But 12 were infinitely more than none. When British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, Rivka weighed 70 pounds and was 26 years old. Her body looked like that of a 60-year-old woman. Her hair had begun to turn white prematurely. She was taken to a field hospital, along with thousands of other survivors. They gave her food her stomach could barely tolerate. Water she drank in tiny sips. Medicines that eased symptoms but did not heal trauma or restore what had been taken. Names, faces, years. None of it could be recovered. After the war, in the displaced persons camps in Germany, Rivka did not speak for 2 full years. It wasn't because she couldn't speak physically. Her throat worked. Her vocal cords were intact. The silence came from somewhere else. She didn't know what to say, or how to translate what she had seen into words other people could understand. How do you explain that you saved more than 100 women with your own hands and still couldn't save your own mother? How do you say that you defied the Nazi system from the inside, manipulating it day after day, and yet didn't stop a single train carrying thousands to their deaths? How do you live with the guilt of surviving when so many others did not? In 1947, Rivka emigrated to the United States through a Jewish aid organization. She settled in New York, in Brooklyn, where other Polish survivors were trying to build new lives on the ruins of old ones. She worked as a seamstress in a garment factory on the Lower East Side, sewing dresses for American women who would never know who had made them. In 1949, she married a Polish survivor named David, who, like her, had lost his entire family in Treblinka. In 1950, they had a son and named him Jacob, after Rivka's brother. In 1953, their daughter Esther was born. She built her life slowly, from fragments, never forgetting a single name or a single face. For decades, Rivka did not speak publicly about what she had done in the ghetto. Not out of shame, not because she wanted to bury the past, but because she genuinely believed no one would believe her. Who would accept that a 24-year-old Jewish woman, with no weapons and no military training, had systematically deceived the Nazi system? Who would believe she saved more than 100 people without outside contacts, without explosives, without partisans or armies? No one. So she stayed silent and went on living. In 1978, a young historian named Daniel Rotman, researching Jewish resistance in the ghetto for his doctoral thesis, came across vague, fragmented references in German documents to an unidentified woman who altered deportation lists. He followed the trail for 3 years, interviewing survivors scattered across the world, until he finally found Rivka Adler's name in immigration records. He wrote her a letter, then another. Eventually, Rivka agreed to meet him. She was 59 when they sat in the modest living room of her Brooklyn apartment. Her hair was completely white. Her hands trembled from arthritis that already made sewing difficult. But her memory was intact, precise, almost photographic. For 5 straight hours, she spoke for the first time in decades. She told him everything she remembered, every name she saved, every number she memorized, every calculated risk, every unexpected success, every devastating failure. The historian recorded it all on cassette tapes that are still preserved in archives. When she finished, when there were no words left, tears were silently running down Daniel Rotman's face. "Why did you never tell this story before?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you stay silent for 30 years? Rivka smiled sadly, with the smile she had learned to use in the ghetto to hide pain. "Because the heroes history remembers are the ones who win wars," she said. "The ones who defeat armies and liberate countries. I only won days. One day here, another there. And days don't seem like enough to be called heroism." The historian shook his head and wiped his eyes. "Days are everything," he said. "They are literally all we have. And you gave thousands of extra days to hundreds of people." Rivka Adler died on September 14, 2000, in her Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by her family, her husband David, her 2 children, and 5 grandchildren. She was exactly 81 years old. At her funeral, no medals were mentioned, no monuments unveiled. There were no speeches about battles or victories, only names and days. 4 days later, more than 200 people attended. It was an unexpected number for someone who had lived such a quiet life. There were close family members, friends from the Brooklyn Jewish community, and neighbors who knew her only as the kind woman on the 3rd floor who always said hello. But at the back of the cemetery stood a smaller group, about 20 elderly women, silent, respectful. They were very old. Some leaned on canes. Others sat in wheelchairs. All of them bore faded numbers tattooed on their forearms, blurred by time but still visible to anyone who knew where to look. They were all survivors of the ghetto, and every one of them owed her life directly to a woman who never sought recognition, never asked for gratitude, and never wanted to be remembered as a hero. After the burial, when most people had already left, one of them, a 78-year-old woman who had been saved in March 1943 when she was just 19, slowly approached the freshly covered grave. With difficulty, she knelt and placed a small handwritten note in blue ink on folded paper. The note said simply, "Thank you for giving me one more day," and then another, and another, and another, until days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years, and years became an entire life. Everything I am, everything I did, everyone I loved exists because you decided it was worth risking yourself to save a stranger. The story of Rivka Adler does not appear in standard World War II textbooks. There are no imposing monuments with her name carved in marble, no streets named after her in Poland, Israel, or the United States, no big-budget films telling her life story. But somewhere in New York, in Tel Aviv, in Montreal, in Buenos Aires, there are 12 women who reached the end of the war alive directly because of her. Those 12 women had children, 34 of them. Those children had 89 grandchildren, and those grandchildren are now having children of their own. Great-grandchildren who are alive today, who walk the world, who study at universities, who work in hospitals, who teach in schools, who love and are loved, without knowing that their entire existence depends on a young Jewish woman from Radom who decided 80 years ago that surviving was not enough. Because in the darkest place of the 20th century, at the heart of the most efficient system ever designed to exterminate human life, Rivka Adler proved something essential about human nature. Even when everything seems sealed for death, there are always small spaces, invisible to those who do not look for them, but wide enough for life to seep through, drop by drop. And sometimes, those drops are enough to form rivers. If you know someone from your city or your country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. If this story moved you, support it with a simple gesture. The next invisible hero might be yours.